What if the person you trusted the most turned out to be the one who destroyed your world? A young boy uncovers the chilling truth about his father's death, a betrayal so dark it will leave you speechless. But when the truth is revealed, will justice prevail, or will the darkness consume everything? Watch now to uncover the shocking twist in this tale of betrayal and revenge. Hi friends, welcome my YouTube channel Storytime. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. The village lay quiet under the glow of the setting sun, its dirt paths lined with the gentle hum of daily life winding down. Farmers returned home with their tools slung over their shoulders, their faces tired but content. Children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, and the air carried the faint aroma of wood fires being lit for the evening meal. Amidst this tranquil scene, Ibrahim sat in the courtyard of his modest home, sipping tea with his 10-year-old son, Rahim. Rahim sat cross-legged on the floor, eagerly recounting his day's adventures to his father. His animated hands gestured as he talked about helping a bird find its nest and his playful arguments with his friends. Ibrahim smiled warmly, nodding along, his eyes reflecting his immense pride and love for his son. "You're growing up to be a fine young man, Rahim," Ibrahim said, ruffling his son's hair affectionately. "But remember, a good heart is what truly makes a man strong." These words stayed with Rahim long after they were spoken. Ibrahim was not just a father to Rahim but a teacher, a protector, and a source of unending inspiration. He was a man revered by the villagers, known for his integrity, humility, and readiness to help those in need. Ibrahim's presence was a pillar of strength not just for his family but for the entire village. But not everyone admired him. In the shadows of his noble character lurked envy, and that envy took the form of his younger brother, Faizan. Faizan had always lived in Ibrahim's shadow. Where Ibrahim was loved and respected, Faizan was tolerated at best. His sharp tongue and selfish tendencies had alienated him from the villagers. But what gnawed at him most was how Ibrahim always seemed to have everything, wealth, respect, and a loving family, while he was left with nothing. Over the years, this envy grew into a poisonous hatred, and Faizan's heart was consumed by thoughts of vengeance. Late one evening, while the moon hung high in the sky, Ibrahim decided to inspect his farmland. The cool breeze carried the scent of freshly tilled earth as he walked through the fields, lantern in hand. The rhythmic chirping of crickets filled the air, creating a sense of calm that belied the storm brewing nearby. Faizan had been watching his brother for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Tonight, he had decided, would be the night his hatred found its outlet. "Brother, are you here?" Faizan called out, stepping into the clearing where Ibrahim was checking the irrigation channels. His voice carried a deceptive softness, masking the dark intent behind it. Ibrahim turned, his face lighting up when he saw Faizan. "Faizan, what brings you here at this hour?" he asked, his tone warm and welcoming. "I wanted to talk to you," Faizan replied, stepping closer. "It's about the land." Ibrahim frowned slightly but nodded, gesturing for his brother to sit beside him. "Tell me, what's on your mind?" Faizan hesitated, his fingers tightening around the handle of the knife hidden in his sleeve. The weight of his plan pressed heavily on him, but his greed and resentment overpowered any remaining conscience. "You've always been the better one," Faizan began, his voice trembling slightly. "The one everyone admires, the one everyone loves. Do you know what it feels like to live in someone's shadow?" Ibrahim looked at his brother, confused. "Faizan, you're my brother. Whatever I have is yours as well. Why do you speak this way?" Faizan's face twisted in anger. "Because it's not enough. Your generosity is just another way to show how much better you are than me. But tonight, that ends." Before Ibrahim could react, Faizan lunged forward, plunging the knife into his brother's chest. The force of the attack knocked Ibrahim to the ground, his lantern shattering and plunging the field into darkness. The pain was searing, but what hurt Ibrahim more was the betrayal etched into his brother's face. He gasped, struggling to understand what had just happened. "Faizan, why?" he choked out, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. Phazon knelt beside his dying brother, his expression a mixture of rage and twisted satisfaction. "Because this is the only way I can take what should have been mine," he spat. "The respect, the land, the power, it's all mine now." Ibrahim's hand reached out weakly, as if trying to grasp his brother's face, searching for the Phazon he once knew. But his strength failed him, and his hand fell limply to the ground. His last breath escaped as his eyes closed, leaving the world forever. For a moment, Phazon sat there, his chest heaving as he stared at his brother's lifeless body. The enormity of his crime began to sink in, but he quickly pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to feel guilt, not now. He wiped the blood from his hands and knife, his mind racing as he began to stage the scene. He overturned tools, scattered some hay, and dragged Ibrahim's body to make it appear as though he had fallen while working. By the time he was finished, the scene looked like a tragic accident. The next morning, the village awoke to the shocking news of Ibrahim's death. Villagers gathered around the field, their faces etched with grief and disbelief. Phazon stood among them, playing the role of the devastated brother. "Ibrahim, my dear brother," he wailed, falling to his knees beside the body. "How could this happen?" The villagers shook their heads, murmuring words of sorrow and sympathy. "It's a terrible accident," one of them said. "Ibrahim was such a good man." Rahim, too young to fully understand the loss, clung to his father's body, his small hands gripping Ibrahim's cold, lifeless arm. "Baba, please wake up," he sobbed. "Don't leave me." Phazon knelt beside the boy, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Rahim, I know this is hard," he said, his voice thick with feigned emotion. "But I'll take care of you now. Your father would have wanted that." Rahim looked up at his uncle, his tear-filled eyes searching for comfort. "You promise?" he asked in a trembling voice. "I promise," Phazon said, pulling the boy into a hug. But in his heart, there was no love, only a cold, calculating resolve to maintain his new position of power. As the days turned into weeks, Phazon assumed control of Ibrahim's land and property, becoming the head of the household. To the villagers, it seemed like he was stepping up as a responsible guardian for Rahim, but behind closed doors, his true nature began to reveal itself. Rahim, still reeling from his father's death, found solace in the memories of the man he had lost. He often visited his father's grave, sitting silently for hours, talking to the headstone as if Ibrahim could still hear him. "Baba, I miss you," he would whisper. "Uncle Phazon is taking care of me, but it's not the same. I wish you were here." What Rahim didn't know was that the man he now depended on was the very reason his father was no longer with him. Phazon, though outwardly calm, carried the weight of his crime. But his guilt was buried deep beneath layers of greed and pride. He believed his secret was safe, unaware that the truth had a way of surfacing, and the boy he underestimated would one day seek the justice his father deserved. Rahim's world had changed forever. His once joyous days were now filled with sorrow, and his nights brought restless dreams of his father's smiling face, only to wake up and remember that Ibrahim was gone. Though Phazon had stepped in as his guardian, the warmth and love that Ibrahim provided could never be replaced. Phazon, meanwhile, was thriving in his new role as head of the household. With Ibrahim's death dismissed as a tragic accident, he controlled the land, the wealth, and, most importantly, Rahim's future. But power brought arrogance, and Phazon's mask of kindness began to slip, revealing the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. It began with little things. Phazon, once so compassionate in his pretense, started becoming impatient with Rahim. The boy, still grieving, would often sit quietly in corners or stare out at the fields where his father used to work. "Stop sulking and do something useful," Phazon would bark, his tone sharp and unkind. Rahim, taken aback, would nod silently and try to follow his uncle's commands. But the change was noticeable. Ibrahim had never raised his voice at him, and this sudden harshness confused and hurt the boy. The villagers, too, began to notice changes in Phazon. While he still performed the role of the grieving brother in public, his newfound authority made him bolder. He demanded higher rents from tenants on the land he now controlled and dismissed the pleas of those who struggled to pay. The generosity that had defined Ibrahim was nowhere to be found in Faison. "He's not like his brother," one villager whispered to another as they watched Faison berate a poor farmer. "Ibrahim would have helped that man." "Maybe grief has hardened his heart," another replied. But doubts lingered in the minds of many. For Rahim, life became a delicate balance of trying to please his uncle and preserving the memory of his father. Every evening, he would visit Ibrahim's grave, sitting there for hours, speaking to the stone marker as if it could answer him. "Baba," he whispered one evening, his small voice carried by the wind, "I don't know what to do. Uncle Faison says he's taking care of me, but it doesn't feel right. He's so different now. You would know what to do. I wish you could tell me." Unbeknownst to Rahim, Faison had started to grow uneasy about the boy's constant visits to the grave. Though the man had convinced himself that his secret was safe, there was something unsettling about the way Rahim spoke to his father as if he were searching for answers. One evening, Faison approached Rahim as the boy sat by the grave. "What are you doing here again?" Faison asked, his voice sharp. Rahim looked up, startled. "I was just talking to Baba," he said softly. Faison's expression hardened. "Your father is gone, Rahim. Sitting here won't bring him back. You need to move on." "But I miss him," Rahim replied, tears welling up in his eyes. "I feel like he can still hear me." Faison's jaw clenched. "Enough of this nonsense," he snapped. "Get inside. It's late." Rahim stood slowly, casting one last glance at the grave before walking back to the house. Faison watched him go, a flicker of guilt crossing his face before he buried it deep within himself. As weeks turned into months, Rahim began to notice more oddities in his uncle's behavior. Faison, once careful to maintain his image, started letting his guard down. On several occasions, Rahim overheard him speaking to himself in hushed tones, pacing the house late at night. One night, curiosity got the better of the boy. He crept out of his room and followed the sound of Faison's voice to the courtyard. Hiding behind a pillar, he listened as his uncle muttered to himself. "It's done. It's over." "No one knows," Faison whispered, his tone anxious. "But why does it feel like he's still watching me? That boy, he's always staring, always asking questions. What if he finds out?" Rahim's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't understand the full meaning of his uncle's words, but they planted a seed of doubt in his mind. What was Faison hiding? The next day, Rahim decided to talk to one of the villagers who had been close to his father, an elderly man named Yusuf. Yusuf had known Ibrahim since they were children and had always been a source of wisdom for the family. "Uncle Yusuf," Rahim began hesitantly as he approached the old man in the marketplace, "can I ask you something?" Yusuf smiled kindly. "Of course, Rahim. What's on your mind?" Rahim hesitated, unsure of how to voice his concerns. Do you think Baba's death was really an accident?" Yusuf's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Why do you ask that, my boy?" "I don't know," Rahim admitted. "It's just. Uncle Faison is different now. He gets angry a lot, and sometimes he says things that don't make sense. I feel like something isn't right." Yusuf placed a hand on Rahim's shoulder, his expression serious. "Ibrahim was a good man, and his death was a great loss to us all. If you feel something is wrong, trust your instincts. But be careful, Rahim. Some truths are dangerous to uncover." Rahim couldn't shake the feeling that Yusuf was right. He began paying closer attention to Faison's actions, watching for clues that might explain his uncle's strange behavior. The more he observed, the more uneasy he became. Faison's temper grew shorter with each passing day, and his interactions with Rahim became colder. One evening, as Rahim was cleaning the courtyard, Phazon stormed in, his face red with anger. "Why is this place still dirty?" he barked. "Can't you do anything right?" "I'm sorry, Uncle," Rahim said quickly, his hands trembling. "I'll finish it now." Phazon glared at him, his fists clenched. For a moment, Rahim thought his uncle might hit him, but instead, Phazon turned and stormed out of the room. Later that night, Rahim sat in his room, clutching a small wooden toy his father had made for him. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "Baba, I wish you were here. I don't understand what's happening, but I'll find out. I promise." One day, while cleaning Phazon's room, Rahim discovered something that deepened his suspicions. Hidden in a corner of the wardrobe was a blood-stained piece of cloth. Rahim's heart raced as he stared at it, his mind flashing back to the night his father died. Could this be connected? Before he could think further, he heard Phazon's footsteps approaching. Panicking, Rahim quickly shoved the cloth back where he found it and left the room. That night, as he lay in bed, Rahim couldn't stop thinking about the cloth. It was the first tangible piece of evidence that something was wrong, but he didn't know what to do with it. He felt trapped, unable to confront Phazon but unwilling to let the matter rest. In the days that followed, Rahim became more determined than ever to uncover the truth. He started asking discreet questions around the village, trying to piece together the events leading up to his father's death. Most of the villagers dismissed his questions, believing the official story of an accident, but a few shared their doubts. There was something strange about that night, one farmer admitted. Ibrahim was always so careful with his tools. It doesn't make sense that he would fall like that. Another villager added, and Phazon, he's been acting so different since then. It's like he's a completely different person. Rahim's suspicions grew stronger with every conversation. He didn't know how, but he was certain Phazon was hiding something. And whatever it was, Rahim was determined to find out. Rahim's suspicions gnawed at him like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. Every moment he spent in Phazon's presence felt suffocating, and his uncle's temper only made matters worse. Yet, Rahim kept his emotions in check, knowing that any sign of rebellion could provoke Phazon further. Still, the boy was determined. The blood-stained cloth he had found, combined with Phazon's odd behavior and the doubts whispered by villagers, convinced him that his uncle wasn't the man he pretended to be. But how could he prove it? And more importantly, how could a child take on a grown man with such a dangerous secret? One evening, as the moon cast its pale light over the village, Rahim decided to revisit his father's grave. The quiet of the night was comforting, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his heart. Sitting cross-legged by the headstone, he placed his small hands on the cold earth. "Baba," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I think I know what happened to you. But I'm scared. Uncle Phazon. I think he did something terrible. How do I prove it? What do I do?" The wind picked up, rustling the nearby trees as if nature itself was responding to his plea. Rahim sat there for a long time, lost in thought. He knew he couldn't rely on the villagers, most believed Phazon's version of events, and those who doubted lacked any evidence to support their suspicions. If Rahim was going to uncover the truth, he would have to do it on his own. The following day, Rahim decided to investigate the field where his father had died. It had been months since the incident, but he hoped to find something, anything, that might shed light on what had happened that fateful night. He waited until Phazon left for the marketplace, then made his way to the field. The sun was high, casting harsh shadows over the uneven terrain. Rahim stood at the spot where his father's body had been found, his heart pounding as he tried to imagine what had happened. He combed through the area carefully, examining every detail. The ground was hard and dry, but near a patch of tall grass, he noticed something unusual, a faint stain on a rock, almost faded but still visible. Rahim crouched down, his fingers trembling as he touched it. Blood. The discovery sent a chill down his spine. If this was where his father had fallen, why wasn't the blood near the tools as Phazon had claimed? The discrepancy made Rahim even more certain that the accident was a lie. That evening, Rahim tried to act as normal as possible, though his mind was racing. He couldn't confront Faison directly, not yet. But he knew his uncle's temper and arrogance could be his undoing. If Rahim could provoke Faison enough, perhaps the man would slip up and reveal the truth. During dinner, Rahim sat across from Faison, watching him carefully. His uncle seemed distracted, his brows furrowed as he ate in silence. "Uncle," Rahim began cautiously, "do you remember the night Baba died?" Faison froze, his fork hovering midair. "Why are you asking about that?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I was just wondering," Rahim said innocently. "You were the last person to see him, right?" Faison's eyes narrowed. "Yes. And I told you what happened. It was an accident." Rahim nodded, pretending to accept the explanation. But he pressed on. "It must have been hard for you, finding him like that. Were you scared?" "I don't want to talk about it," Faison snapped, slamming his fork down on the table. "Stop bringing up the past. What's done is done." Rahim flinched at his uncle's outburst but held his gaze. "I just miss him," he said softly. "That's all." Faison muttered something under his breath and left the room, leaving Rahim alone with his thoughts. Though his uncle hadn't revealed anything outright, his reaction only confirmed Rahim's suspicions. Over the next few days, Rahim began to piece together a plan. He couldn't rely on physical evidence alone, it was too circumstantial, and Faison would surely deny everything. What Rahim needed was a confession, and he knew just how to get one. Late one night, after Faison had gone to bed, Rahim slipped into the kitchen and retrieved a piece of paper and a pencil. Sitting by the dim light of a lantern, he carefully wrote a note in shaky handwriting. "I know what you did. Meet me in the field where it happened." Rahim folded the note and slipped it into Faison's room, leaving it on the bedside table. Then he returned to his own room, his heart pounding with fear and anticipation. The next morning, Faison found the note. His face went pale as he read it, and he quickly looked around, as if expecting to see someone watching him. The words felt like a ghostly whisper from his past, and for a moment, he wondered if Ibrahim's spirit was haunting him. But Faison wasn't a man to be easily shaken. He crumpled the note in his fist, his mind racing. Who could have sent this? Was it one of the villagers? Or? His thoughts turned to Rahim. The boy had been acting strangely lately, asking too many questions and spending too much time at the grave. Could it be him? That evening, Faison went to the field, just as the note instructed. The sun had set, and the landscape was bathed in darkness, with only the faint glow of the moon to light the way. Faison stood in the center of the field, his nerves on edge. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the silence. Rahim watched from the shadows, hiding behind a large tree. He had planned this moment carefully, knowing that fear and guilt could make people reveal things they otherwise wouldn't. "You know what you did," Rahim said, his voice trembling as he tried to sound more confident than he felt. "It's time to tell the truth." Faison spun around, his eyes darting in every direction. "Who's there? Show yourself." Rahim stepped out of the shadows, his small frame illuminated by the moonlight. "It's me," he said, his voice steady now. "I know what you did to Baba." Faison's face twisted in anger and panic. "You don't know anything," he snarled. "You're just a child." "I know you lied," Rahim said, stepping closer. "I know Baba didn't die in an accident. You killed him, didn't you?" Faison's fists clenched, and for a moment, it looked like he might strike the boy. But then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a bitter laugh. "You're smarter than I thought," he said. Rahim's heart raced as he realized what was happening. "So it's true?" he asked, his voice shaking. Faison's expression darkened. "Yes, it's true," he admitted, his voice low and menacing. "I killed your father. And do you know why? Because he always had everything, respect, wealth, love, while I had nothing. I was tired of living in his shadow. So I took what should have been mine. Rahim stared at his uncle, his small hands curling into fists. You betrayed him, he said, his voice filled with quiet rage. He trusted you. He loved you. Love doesn't put food on the table, Faison snapped. Love doesn't earn respect. I did what I had to do to survive. Rahim shook his head, tears streaming down his face. You're a coward, he said. And I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. Faison's eyes widened in fear, but before he could react, Rahim turned and ran back toward the village, leaving his uncle alone in the field, consumed by the weight of his confession. Rahim's legs carried him faster than he had ever run before. The cool night air lashed at his face, but he didn't stop. His uncle's confession echoed in his ears, each word like a dagger cutting into his heart. I killed your father. The truth was out, but Rahim knew it was far from over. Faison was dangerous, and if the man realized what Rahim intended to do, he wouldn't hesitate to strike again. Reaching the edge of the village, Rahim stopped to catch his breath. The streets were quiet, the villagers asleep in their homes. His mind raced. Who would believe him? A child's word against a man as powerful and manipulative as Faison? Rahim needed more than just his voice, he needed proof. The next morning, Faison pretended as if nothing had happened, but his nerves betrayed him. He avoided Rahim's gaze and snapped at the servants over the smallest mistakes. Inside, he was a storm of panic and anger. The boy knew too much. Could he be silenced? But Rahim was no longer the timid child Faison thought he could control. The boy spent the day quietly gathering allies, people he trusted to help him expose his uncle. Rahim started with Yusuf, the elderly villager who had always been a friend to his family. Approaching the man's modest home, Rahim knocked on the wooden door. Rahim. Yusuf opened the door, his eyes widening in surprise. What are you doing here so early? I need your help, Rahim said, his voice trembling. It's about my father. Yusuf ushered him inside and closed the door. Tell me everything, he said. Rahim recounted the events of the previous night, describing Faison's confession in detail. Yusuf listened intently, his expression growing darker with every word. So it's true, Yusuf said finally, his voice filled with sorrow. I always suspected Faison had something to do with Ibrahim's death, but to hear it confirmed. We need to stop him, Rahim said, his small hands clenched into fists. But I don't know how. Yusuf placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. You're brave, Rahim, braver than most adults I know. We'll find a way to bring him to justice. But we must be careful. Faison won't give up his power easily. The first step was to gather evidence. Rahim and Yusuf returned to the field where Ibrahim had died, searching for clues that might support Rahim's claim. They examined the blood-stained rock and the surrounding area, but it wasn't enough. Then Rahim remembered the bloodied cloth he had found in Faison's room. It was risky, but if he could retrieve it, it might be the key to proving his uncle's guilt. That night, while Faison was out meeting with the village elders, Rahim sneaked into his uncle's room. His heart pounded as he searched the wardrobe, carefully sifting through its contents. At last, he found the cloth, still hidden where he had left it. Clutching it tightly, he slipped out of the room and ran back to Yusuf's house. This will help, Yusuf said, examining the cloth. But we'll need more if we're to convince the village. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A few days later, Faison hosted a gathering of the village elders at his home, a routine meeting to discuss community matters. Rahim and Yusuf saw their chance. As the elders gathered in the courtyard, Yusuf stood and addressed the group. I have something important to say, he began, his voice firm. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. Faison, sitting at the head of the table, narrowed his eyes. What is it, Yusuf? He asked, his tone wary. It's about Ibrahim's death, Yusuf said. And the truth that has been hidden from us all. Faizen's face darkened. This is not the time for such discussions. It is exactly the time, Yusuf countered. The boy has something to share. Rahim. All eyes turned to Rahim as he stepped forward, clutching the blood-stained cloth. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady. My father didn't die in an accident, he said. Uncle Faizen killed him. He admitted it to me. A murmur swept through the group, disbelief and shock written on their faces. Lies. Faizen thundered, rising from his seat. This child is making up stories. Yusuf has poisoned his mind. Rahim held up the cloth. Then explain this, he said. I found it in your room. It's covered in blood. Faizen faltered, his composure slipping. That proves nothing, he said, his voice shaky. But the villagers weren't convinced. Rahim's calm determination and Faizen's growing desperation spoke volumes. One of the elders, a stern man named Karim, stood. If you have nothing to hide, Faizen, then you won't mind if we investigate further, he said. Faizen glared at him but said nothing. The investigation revealed more damning evidence. A villager who had seen Faizen near the field on the night of Ibrahim's death came forward, corroborating Rahim's story. Others began to speak out about Faizen's behavior in the months following the incident, painting a picture of a man consumed by guilt and paranoia. In the end, the truth was undeniable. Faced with mounting evidence and the weight of his own guilt, Faizen broke down. Yes, he confessed, his voice choked with emotion. I killed Ibrahim. I was jealous of him, jealous of everything he had. I thought if I got rid of him, I could take his place. But I was wrong. I've lived with the shame every day since. The villagers listened in stunned silence as Faizen recounted the crime. When he finished, there was no anger, only sadness. The man they had once trusted had betrayed them all. With Faizen's confession, the village was left reeling. Ibrahim had been a beloved figure, a man who represented fairness and compassion. The revelation that his own brother had betrayed him was a wound that cut deep into the fabric of their community. The elders convened to decide Faizen's fate. While some called for severe punishment, others advocated for leniency, citing the remorse he had shown. Rahim, however, had no doubt about what he wanted. He has to pay for what he did, Rahim said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Not just for my father, but for everyone he hurt. The decision was made. Faizen would be stripped of his authority and exiled from the village. It wasn't the harshest punishment, but it ensured he could no longer harm anyone. As Faizen prepared to leave, he sought out Rahim. The boy stood in the courtyard, watching as the villagers gathered to see his uncle off. I'm sorry, Rahim, Faizen said, his voice heavy with regret. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll understand why I did what I did. Rahim looked at him, his expression unreadable. You killed my father, he said simply. That's all I'll ever understand. Faizen nodded, accepting the boy's words as the price of his actions. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving the village and his former life behind. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to normal. The villagers rallied around Rahim, offering their support and ensuring he was cared for. Yusuf became a surrogate father figure, guiding the boy with kindness and wisdom. Though the pain of losing his father would never fully heal, Rahim found solace in the knowledge that justice had been served. He spent his days working in the fields Ibrahim had loved so much, determined to honor his father's legacy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rahim stood by his father's grave. I did it, Baba, he whispered. I kept my promise. I hope you're proud of me. The wind rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, carrying with it a sense of peace. And for the first time in months, Rahim allowed himself to smile. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget subscribe, share and like.